Here we are on the final service of the final day of the days of unleavened bread. 7 days have gone by, 7 days during which we have been conscious of leavening, conscious of avoiding certain things, conscious of ingesting certain things. We went through a great deal of preparation, a great deal of hustle and bustle prior to the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, getting ready. We have been conscious of some of these things. Undoubtedly, if you're like me, every time during the course of the week that you would normally have reached for, with me it particularly hits breakfast time. When I would have reached for a piece of toast or a biscuit, and instead I get this little hard, crunchy thing that doesn't look at all like a good slab of whole wheat toast or big, nice whole wheat biscuit or something like that. Instead, it is something of a totally different sort. And so the point comes back, every time I crunch down on a wheat thin or a matzah or some homemade variety, the point is made that these are special days. These are days that are different from the rest of the year. This is a festival that stands out. And God wants that point impressed upon us. We are physical creatures. We do physical things. And God impresses spiritual lessons by physical things. And that's an important concept to realize, that we learn spiritual lessons by doing physical things, because ultimately everything we do is physical, because we are physical. Now there is a particular book in the Bible that is related to the days of unleavened bread, to this festival, in a very special way. It is a book that I have often gone back to during these days of unleavened bread. There are specific lessons, because a great deal of the activity, some of the most striking activity of the book, relates and centers around the days of unleavened bread, and particularly this final day of unleavened bread. A very dramatic occurrence took place that is recorded in this book. But not only does this book at the beginning focus in on the celebration of the days of unleavened bread and on some of the events that occurred, but at the end of this book, it focuses in on a spiritual lesson that God desires that we glean from this festival. Now, there are 7 specific, as I went back through this book during these days of unleavened bread, as I customarily do, I would say, perhaps I've not every single year, but I would say over the years that I've been in the church, it is a book that I tend to review at this time of the year, because I feel like there is a lot in it that relates to this spring festival. And so, once again, this spring festival, I went back through and reviewed this book, and as I did so, there were 7 lessons that stood out in my mind, 7 specific things that I gleaned from this book that I feel that are very important lessons that are conveyed through this particular book of the Bible, and 7 lessons that are very fitting to focus in upon at the season of the days of unleavened bread, at this particular season and on this particular holy day. Because it is significant that there is a reason why there is the holy day at the end of the days of unleavened bread. The festival is 7 days. You may think, well, you got to start and stop. But the Feast of Tabernacles is also 7 days long. The first day of the Feast of Tabernacles is a holy day, but the 7th day is not. Now there is an 8th day, but it is a separate festival. It is the last great day. It's a separate festival, even though it comes right on the heels of it. But the 7th day of the Feast of Tabernacles does not stand out as unique. The first day does. It's a holy convocation. But with the days of unleavened bread, it's 7 days in length. It is one festival, but it is one festival in which 2 holy days occur. See, it's the only festival that has 2 holy days. Feast of Tabernacles is one festival, and it also has one holy day. Most holy days and most festivals are simply concurrent. They're one day. But this festival stands out as different. I think the simplest way of expressing the lesson as to why there is a holy day at the beginning of the days of unleavened bread and a holy day at the end would be simply summarized by what Paul states in the book of Hebrews when he says that we are to look unto Jesus Christ, the author and finisher of our faith. The whole point of this festival season, as we focus on coming out of Egypt collectively as a church, as a body, as well as individually putting sin out of our lives, because there were both aspects. Israel of old was collectively, as a body, as an entity, as a congregation, as a church, they were collectively to come out of Egypt. As a church, we collectively are to come out of the world. Individually, we are to put sin out of our lives. Individual Israelites cleaned the leavening out and disposed of it. Individually, they ingested unleavened bread. But collectively, as a group, they made an exodus. Collectively, as a group, we are to make an exodus. We are to come out of sin, and we are to rid our lives of sin individually and to replace it. Because you can't get rid of something negative if you don't replace it with something positive. If you just try to get rid of something negative and leave a void, a vacuum in your life, that won't do. That won't work. That's why God didn't make it the 7 days of no bread at all. He made it the 7 days of unleavened bread. Because there is a spiritual lesson to be learned, not only by what we don't eat, but by with what we replace it. That with which we replace it is also to teach us a lesson. Now, this particular book that I make reference to is certainly a book that focuses in on the fact that Jesus Christ is the author and the finisher of our faith. Just as God starts us out on the journey, so He will finish us up. The particular book to which I have reference is the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. We read in the book of Joshua chapter 1 that it came to pass after the death of Moses, the servant of the Eternal, that the Eternal spoke unto Joshua the son of Nun, and he said, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, you and all the people, unto the land which I will give you, even to the children of Israel. Coming on down in verse 6, God told Joshua, He said, Be strong and of good courage, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land which I swore unto their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, to observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left hand, that you may have good success wheresoever you go. You're to observe to do all these things. So he ends up in verse 9 by saying, Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Be not affrighted, neither be you dismayed. The Eternal, your God, is with you, whithersoever you go. The very first point that I want to focus upon, the introduction here to the book of Joshua, there is an emphasis that God's command, the very first thing that God introduces to us, is the statement, the command, to go forward to accomplish the work of God, to do so with courage and with strength, not to deviate one way or the other, but rather to go forward. It involves a commitment. It involves a commitment. The very first thing that God emphasized to Joshua was the matter of commitment. To go boldly forward, with courage, with strength, to avoid compromise in order to accomplish God's work. God has called us for a job. God has called us for a work. God has not called us, Mr. Armstrong used to stress many, many times, that God has not called us simply to acquire personal salvation. Now, obviously, God has called us to salvation, and He never meant to diminish from that at all, but He was emphasizing a point that our calling is not purely a selfish calling. God has not called us to just go and hide in a cave somewhere and sort of live our life and to make it into the kingdom. God has called us to have a part of a great work. Jesus Christ came doing a work. He came proclaiming a message. He came with good news, the good news of the kingdom of God. He came to do a work. We are being called collectively as a first fruits to our God, to do and to accomplish and to achieve the work of the living God. Now, God called Joshua to do a work. Joshua was raised up to continue forward God's work. And it was emphasized to him the necessity of strength and courage. That if he was going to follow where God led, if he was going to achieve what God wanted achieved, it was going to require strength and courage. It was going to require a boldness, a willingness to follow where God led. You see, Joshua had that characteristic. God knew that because going back 39 years earlier, after the children of Israel had been 1 year out of Egypt, you remember the 12 spies went into the promised land. They came back. 10 brought an evil report. 2, Joshua and Caleb, brought a good report. A report of faith. They were willing to follow where God led. The rest weren't. And the nation as a whole was not. If we're going to achieve what God wants achieved, we've got to be willing to follow where God leads. We've got to be willing to go forward. And he says, don't turn to the right hand or to the left. God doesn't want us going off on a tangent. He does not want us getting off track. He wants a commitment, a wholehearted, total, 100% complete commitment. A commitment to go forward, to walk with God. Now, where does the source of this boldness come from, this strength and this courage? Well, what does it say in the 23rd Psalm? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare us a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. Now, what is David inspired to write in the 23rd Psalm? The basis of our confidence, the basis of our boldness, the basis of our courage is not something that we generate within ourselves. It's not purely based on physical prowess and physical strength. It is based on a reliance of the strength of God. Be strong and of a good courage. Which really gets back to see God and rely on Him and trust Him. Because if you really see God, if you rely on God, if you trust God, if you're walking with God, then it doesn't matter. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. I'll have courage. Not because of me, but because of with whom I walk. You remember as a kid going somewhere, maybe you were frightened to go, and how if you were walking with your father, when he took your hand and said, "Come on, you can go with me." All of a sudden, it wasn't nearly so scary. Wasn't nearly so frightening or so scary. Because you weren't by yourself. You were with Him. And you knew He'd take care of things. The basis of our strength and our courage to go forward to achieve what God has called us to do is to go forward with God, to walk with Him. Now, if we're going to walk with Him, we're going to have to walk as He walked. We can't be turning aside to the right hand or to the left, because if you get off the track, if you turn aside, you're not walking with Him. If you get off the track, you're not walking with Him. Therefore, you're by yourself. And if you're out there in the dark in the big bad world all by yourself, you better be scared. The basis of our confidence is that we're not by ourselves. But brethren, when you turn aside to the right hand or to the left, when you get off the track, And you're not walking with God. God emphasized that to Joshua. You know, Mr. Armstrong emphasized over and over again the last years of his life the importance of us as a church getting back on the track. Getting on the track, and the track was God's track. And, you remember that, and he reiterated that and emphasized that, and God raised him back up and gave to him, extended his life for the purpose of so doing, extended his life for 7 years for the purpose of so doing. And that point has been emphasized to us many times. That's the point God emphasized to Joshua. You see, that's why He told him, He said, don't deviate to the right hand or to the left. You walk, be strong and courageous, observe to do what I said. Don't turn to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wheresoever you go. So, if you're walking with God, if you're on the track and you're walking with God, you have a basis of confidence and you have a basis for achievement. You have a basis for success. God has called us to do a work. He's called us to be a part of a work. And He instructed Joshua that the starting point was to follow Him. To follow Him boldly, to follow Him with courage, with confidence, with strength, recognizing that ultimately God is the source of that strength and that confidence and that courage. We're to follow Him, not deviating, not getting off track. We're to follow Him. That's the starting point, the beginning of emphasis. God stresses that here in chapter 1 of the book of Joshua. And in chapter 2, we find that Joshua sends 2 spies. You know, he learned the lesson of what happens when you send 12. He didn't send 12 this time, he sent 2. And I'm sure he was very careful as to whom he picked, you know. You want to pick somebody that's going to come back and tell you what you need, what ought to be told. See, what happened the first time around was they picked the leading man out of each tribe. They picked the prince of each tribe, the 12 princes of Israel, the prince of each tribe. The problem was 10 of them were washouts. So Joshua didn't take a chance. He didn't pick any princes this time. He just handpicked 2 men that he figured he could count on to go in and tell the truth and do what he told them. So they went in, and they went into Jericho. Because Jericho was a major city. Jericho was a heavily fortified city that stood there just as you crossed on the on the west bank, rather, of the Jordan River. And it really was the gateway to the whole Promised Land. It was the capital of the Canaanite Confederation. It was a major city and had been for centuries. And it was there, and it was something that they were going to have to go on past this. And Joshua knew that. So he sent the 2 spies in, and they went into the city, and they checked things out. And word, of course, had already reached. So, very quickly, the king of Jericho sent out soldiers trying to find them. They hid at an inn, which was run by a woman by the name of Rahab. Rahab the harlot, as she is known. And she hid them there, in fact, on the roof of the building. This building was right there next to the wall. It abutted the wall and shared, in fact, the outside wall of the building was the wall of the city. There's an interesting article, any of you who are technically minded in terms of some of these things. There was an excellent article in the magazine Biblical Archaeology Review back several months ago on the walls of Jericho. The point was made that when the excavations were examined and when things were properly lined up, the remarkable thing was that at the time, the Bible said, most of the scholars want to date the Exodus to the 1200s, the 13th century, but when you date it properly by biblical reckoning, which is to the 15th century, about the year 1400 BC, the remarkable thing is when you line up what happened archaeologically, the walls of Jericho came literally tumbling down. And it is a remarkable thing. A very detailed article went through and explained that. And, of course, the scholars are confused over that. They figure that it must have been something else. Certainly couldn't have had anything to do with Joshua here. I mean, the right place at the right time, but certainly couldn't have had anything to do with Joshua. Well, that's silly, you know. There's none so blind as those that will not see, and the truth of God is there and available. But anyway, they came in, they spied out the land. Rahab hid them, she sent them back out, and she acted in faith. So we find they came back, they gave a report. Joshua said, all right, we're going to cross over the Jordan River. And so in Joshua chapter 4, Joshua gave instructions. Because they were going to cross over. They weren't going to go by ferry. They weren't going to go by boat. They weren't going to swim. God was going to magnify Joshua in the sight of the people. So Joshua gave instructions, and we have it recorded here in Joshua chapter 4 and verse 14, that the Eternal magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they did Moses. Because, of course, what happened was that the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant were sent forward, and they came up to the river, and the Jordan River stopped. In fact, there was evidently whether it was a landslide or something, the city of Adam, which was upstream from where they were crossing, because the water stopped at that point. Evidently, God must have sent some sort of a landslide or something into the river at that point, because the river was dammed up, was stopped as a result of God's action at the city of Adam. So what it meant was that the water flowed on down, and within a short time, the river began to run dry. And as the priests took the ark out into the Jordan River, and they stood out there, and the Jordan remained stopped upstream at the city of Adam, and the water had come on down, and the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River. And once they had crossed, finally, when they had all gotten across, 12 men picked up 12 stones out of the middle of the river there where the priests had stood with the ark. The priests in the ark left, and they left and came out. When they came out, whatever God had sent down upstream broke loose, and here came the Jordan River again. And a memorial was set up there. Needless to say, all the people were deeply impressed. Well, in verse 19 of Joshua chapter 4, we're told that the people came up out of the Jordan River on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Now, you remember the significance of the 10th day of the first month? The 10th day of the first month is the date that the Israelites in Exodus 12 were told to select the lamb for the Passover to be sacrificed on the 14th day of the first month. On the 10th day of the first month, they selected the lamb. When you go into the New Testament, you find that the 10th day of the first month coincides with the date of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When he was greeted with the hosannas by the people, this would have coincided with the time that the lamb to be slaughtered was selected. So in that sense, the people unwittingly, as they did not fully recognize the significance of what they did, they acknowledged the Lamb of God sent to take away the sins of the world. Exactly the right time. Well, now here, on the 10th day of the first month, the children of Israel emerged from the Jordan River. They crossed the Jordan River. And the memorial is set up. Now, what God told them, they came across, and they encamped at a place called Gilgal, which was the camp that they set up on this side of the Jordan River. And guess what news God broke to them when they got across the river? In chapter 5, we're told that, in verse 1, we're told that when word got out about what happened to the Jordan, that the kings of the Amorites and the Canaanites, and everybody heard what had happened, that their heart melted. Neither was there any spirit in them anymore. You can imagine, these Canaanite enemies, the enemies of God's people, it says their heart melted, just scared the wits out of them when they realized what had transpired. But at this point, when they got across the Jordan, and they came here and they set up camp at Gilgal, God broke some news to Joshua. Verse 2. The Eternal said unto Joshua, make knives of flint, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. Now, it's called the second time because the generation that had been born in the wilderness had not been circumcised. There was a mass circumcision that took place before the Exodus. Now this occurs once again. He was told to make knives and to circumcise the children of Israel. And Joshua made knives of flint, and he circumcised the children of Israel there. We're told that the reason God did so was that the men who had been circumcised in Egypt, that the adult population that had come out of Egypt had died. Verse 5, the people that came out were circumcised, but the people born in the wilderness, by the way, as they came forth out of Egypt, had not been circumcised. And they had been 40 years. So we're told that in verse 7 that Joshua circumcised this generation. They were uncircumcised because they hadn't been circumcised through the wilderness. And came to pass when all the nation were circumcised, every one of them, they abode in their places in the camp. You can imagine they did. They didn't feel like stirring too far. But, the second point we come to, first thing God told him was, I want you to go forward and I want you to follow me. I want you to go forward and follow me, not deviating to the right hand or to the left. Go forward with confidence, with strength, with courage, with boldness. Very first thing God told Joshua. First instruction. First emphasis of the book of Joshua, to go forward and follow God on track, not deviate. Because when you're following Him and when you're on track, you have a basis for confidence. Second thing He told him was, you can't come in to the land and receive my promises and my blessings and my benefits. You can't come into the covenant land and receive the blessings of the covenant if you don't have the sign of the covenant. You've got to be circumcised. That was the second thing God emphasized to them. This was right prior to the Passover. In fact, down in verse, up in verse 7, it talks about the fact they were circumcised. And in verse 10, then they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. So basically, they had about 3 days to recuperate. And that they had to be circumcised before they kept the Passover, because the commandments were very clear in the book of Exodus that you could not partake of that those who were uncircumcised could not partake of the Passover. Evidently, the Passover had been in abeyance during the 40 years in the wilderness. Now, that's not an heretical statement, but if you consider, what did they eat for 40 years? They ate manna. No indication that the manna was leavened. They had no source of any other food. What they had was manna. You could fry it, you could bake it, you could eat it raw, you could roast it, you could, wad it up, you could stretch it out. You could do all kinds of things with it, but it was still manna. And if you left it out for a day, it rotted and stank and bred worms. Because new manna came every day. You had to go out every day, and the only day you got a double portion was on Friday. So you didn't go out and gather on the Sabbath. So you were reminded every week that the Sabbath is different. That's the day no manna comes. So you didn't have to have a calendar. You wouldn't get confused, Every other day you look up and you could see manna. It says it looked like hoar frost. It just looked like a white frost on the ground. Every day of the week, 6 days until the Sabbath came, you looked out and there wasn't any. Kind of began to dawn on you, this day's a little different. Well, they had gone this period of time in the wilderness. Now they were coming into the land, and the emphasis was, you've got to be circumcised. You're going to observe the Passover, and you're going to enter into God's promises. You've got to have the sign of the covenant. You've got to be circumcised. Now, that applies to us in a very direct way. In a way that sometimes we may not fully realize or appreciate, because we also have to undergo that from a spiritual standpoint. God talks about in the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, Deuteronomy 10:12, now Israel, what does the eternal your God require of you but to fear the eternal your God, to walk in all His ways, to love Him, to serve the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, to keep the commandments of the eternal and His statutes which I command you this day for your good. Verse 16. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. Circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Now what does that mean? Well, back in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 6. Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 6. In verse 5 it says, The eternal your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and He will do you good and multiply you above your fathers. And the eternal your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. Now what did Jesus say was the great commandment when He was asked? He said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul. Love God with everything in you. And love your neighbor as yourself. What was said right here, Deuteronomy 30, this section of Deuteronomy 30 is a promise of Israel being regathered after the tribulation. After the time that Christ comes back and puts an end to the tribulation and He begins to regather the people. And says God's going to bring them into the land which our ancestors possessed. And at that time He's going to circumcise your heart. Now when God brought them in the promised land the first time, they were physically circumcised. They were physically circumcised when they entered the land, but they weren't spiritually circumcised. When God brings our people back, He is going to spiritually circumcise them, to circumcise the heart. Now what does that mean? Well, let's come on forward. Let's notice in Jeremiah chapter 4. Notice that circumcision of the heart is prophesied in the Old Testament. In Jeremiah chapter 4, in verse 4, Circumcise yourselves to the eternal, and take away the foreskins of your heart, you men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my fury come forth like fire and burn, that none can quench it, because of the evil of your doings. So a circumcision of the heart is talked about. The Apostle Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2 and verse 27. Or verse 28. And he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. He is a Jew which is one inwardly. Circumcision is that of the heart. Circumcision of the heart. The spirit of the law. Let's just notice let's notice one other place in Colossians. Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 11. Speaking of Christ, in whom also you are circumcised, with a circumcision made without hands. A circumcision of divine origin. Not something performed, not a physical act performed by a physical human being, as Joshua and those that assisted him physically circumcised the Israelites as they came into the promised land. You're circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. A circumcision of divine origin in putting off the body of sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. The circumcision of the heart had to do with a removal of the covering on your heart that prevents God's Word and God's thoughts from entering. It has to do with creating a heart that is receptive to the divine truth. A circumcised heart is a heart that is not hardened, it's not covered, it is one that is open to God's working, to the influence of God's Spirit. You know, circumcision was the identifying sign of God's covenant people. Spiritual circumcision of the heart, still is an identifying sign of God's covenant people. It involves what is in reality, both physically and spiritually, what is a painful removal of what is natural. Because the natural man, the carnal mind, The heart which is deceitful above all things, who can know it? The heart, oh, that there were such a heart in them that they would obey me. You can go through all of the Scriptures in the book of Jeremiah and other places that deal with some of these things, that deal with the fact that humanly, naturally, the carnal mind, the natural man, is not receptive to the things of God. So that which blocks that receptivity has to be removed. Conversion is what is being discussed. A circumcision of the heart. A circumcision of the heart. If we're first and foremost, God commands His people, He calls us to go forward to do His work. He calls us to go forward, on track, not deviating, not getting off track, not going to the right hand or to the left, but being on track, straight on track, going forward with courage and boldness, following Christ. We're called collectively to follow God, to stay on track, to go forward with boldness. Individually and personally, we're told that if we want to have any part in it, we've got to be circumcised. We've got to have a circumcision of the heart. A circumcision made without hands, one that is of divine origin. One that removes those characteristics of our heart and mind that block receptivity to God's will, to God's Word. That makes us open and receptive to God's working in our hearts and in our minds. So this is stressed, and we find that at this point, Israel had to take upon themselves the sign of the covenant. They had to step out in faith. In order to do that, yield themselves to what God said. Then they proceeded to go forward and to keep the Passover on the 14th day of the month, the first month, at evening in the plains of Jericho. Joshua chapter 5 and verse 10. And they did eat of the produce of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day. Now, if you were to go back to Leviticus 23, you would see a point that is made here that you have to read carefully in verse 11. But as is brought out in the Jewish commentary, that the morrow after the Passover is here identical with the morrow after the Sabbath in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 10 through 14. If you go back to Leviticus 23, 10 through 14, you'll find that they could not eat of the produce of the land until the wave sheaf had been offered, which dedicated the first fruits to God. That the wave sheaf was offered on the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. And the morrow after the Sabbath, or the Sunday, during the days of unleavened bread. Now, the question comes up, as occasionally happens, it did not occur this year, but what if the Passover, the 14th day of the first month, is on a Saturday? This year it came on a Friday. What if it came on a Saturday? Which would be the morrow after the Sabbath? Would it be the Sabbath would it be the first? You see, then the days of unleavened bread would run Sunday through Saturday. They would run exactly following a week. Which Sunday would be the wave sheaf Sunday? Would it be the first holy day? Or would it be the day after the last holy day? The answer is contained right here in verse 11. Because they ate of the the produce of the land on the morrow after the Passover. In other words, on the first holy day, on the 15th day of the first month. As the Jewish commentary brings out, as the rabbis understood, clearly understanding the law of Leviticus 23, that the morrow after the Passover had to be identical with the morrow after the Sabbath. Which means that the Passover this year fell on a weekly Sabbath. And that the first holy day of unleavened bread was also, the first holy day of unleavened bread was a Sunday, and it was also the day of the wave sheaf. And that's why Israel ate, for the first time, they ate produce, and they ate unleavened cakes. because it was the first holy day of the days of unleavened bread. They ate unleavened cakes and parched corn the self-same day. Now, this was here outside Jericho. Now, Jericho, we're told in chapter 6 and verse 1, had been straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. When they crossed the Jordan River, they shut the gates of Jericho. They crossed the Jordan, you remember, 4 days earlier on the 10th day of the first month. They shut the gates of Jericho and they didn't let anybody go out and anybody come in. They were preparing for a siege. But this was an unusual siege because God gave Joshua instructions. He said, I have given Jericho into your hand. Now, you're going to compass the city. I'm reading chapter 6, verse 3. You're going to go about the city one time. You're going to do this for 6 days, and 7 priests shall bear 7 ram's horns before the ark. And the 7th day you'll compass the city 7 times. The priest will blow the horn, and when they make a long blast with the ram's horns, and you hear the sound, all the people will shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. Now, Jewish tradition has understood, chapter 6, verse 15 says, came to pass on the 7th day they rose early and compassed the city 7 times. Jewish tradition has held that this was on a weekly Sabbath. Well, this, of course, ties in with what we saw in Joshua 5. If Passover was on a Sabbath and the first holy day was on a Sunday, that means that the last holy day was on the weekly Sabbath. Jericho was compassed about during the 7 days of unleavened bread. Here's the 7 days that they went around the city. Jericho was the symbol of Satan's world. Jericho was the symbol of Satan's world. When you go through the account in Joshua, it is implied that it was the Passover season. It does not explicitly state it in Joshua, but Josephus, the Jewish priest and historian of the time of Christ, states so explicitly in his Antiquities of the Jews. And the Jews have always held by tradition that this coincided with the days of unleavened bread. And that's certainly the implication of the account in Joshua. That they came up, they were circumcised, they celebrated the Passover, they compassed the city. Every morning, bright and early, they came out and they walked around the city. And you can imagine, people standing up there looking down, wondering what in the world is going on. Everybody comes out, they march around one time, go back to camp. And they do it on the first day, and they do it on the second day, and the third day, and the fourth day, and the fifth day, and the 6th day. And people must have been scratching their heads and wondering what in the world is going on. And then on the 7th day, they come out. Early, the equivalent of early this morning, they came out and they went around the city. And when they got back where they would have normally gone back home, they didn't. They kept going. And they went around the city again. And around the city again. And a 4th time. And a 5th time. And a 6th time. And a 7th time, they walked around the city. Now, if it hadn't been a big city, they'd have been getting dizzy by that time. But it was, big enough. So hopefully they weren't too dizzy by the time they had gone around the 7th time. And the priest blew the trumpet, and the people shouted, and the walls of Jericho came down. God stepped in. God intervened. God granted the victory to His people. Because ultimately God's work, and this is the third lesson and the third thing that I would like to emphasize that we glean from the book of Joshua, is God's work is accomplished by God's power. Not by our own might or power, not by our physical strength and prowess, not by our ingenuity and our cleverness. God does not need us. We need God. God has chosen to work through us, but the need is not on God's part, it's on ours. God chose to work through the children of Israel, and He was going to give them the inheritance of the promised land. And He brought them out, and He chose to do it in a dramatic way. And they walked around and around and around. And on the 7th day, the final holy day of the days of unleavened bread, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Satan's society collapsed and crumbled at the onslaught of the people of God. We're told, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell, the gates of the grave shall not prevail against it. Jesus Christ sent forth His church to do a job. And it is not by our own physical might or power that we will accomplish what God has called us to do. It is by the power of God. So on the seventh day, the walls came tumbling down. And God instructed the children of Israel through Joshua in verse 18, Joshua 6, "You shall in any wise keep yourself from the devoted thing," or the accursed thing. It was devoted to God, and accursed if people touched it. I'm reading from the Jewish translation, if you notice a little slight difference in wording from your translation or King James or whatever you're using. "You shall in any wise keep yourself from the devoted thing, lest you make yourselves accursed by taking of the devoted thing. So should you make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. All the silver and gold, the vessels of brass and iron are holy to the Eternal. They shall come unto the treasury of the Eternal." So God had given them instructions when they came in and took Jericho. The walls came down, everything was to be destroyed. Certain things were to be devoted to God. The people were not to take any plunder. It took a miracle of God. It took God's intervention to grant His people the victory. God's work. The third thing we have emphasized to us is that God's work is accomplished. It is fulfilled through the power of God. It is God's, not by might or by power, humanly and physically, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Eternal. So Jericho fell down, and Rahab and her family were the only ones spared. They haven't finished excavating, by the way, all the way around the walls of Jericho. They've only certain small sections. When they get all the way around, they're really going to have something to explain, because they're going to find one little section that didn't fall down. Right now, they're speculating, well, there must have been an earthquake. Certainly couldn't have had anything to do with Joshua. But it must have been, they had an earthquake around that time. The walls came down. They're going to really get to scratch their heads when they finish getting around the city, and they find that for some reason, one part of the wall was earthquake resistant. Maybe it was built to California code, and all the rest wasn't. Well, it didn't have anything to do with California code. It had to do with, God maybe had a couple of angels dispatched there to kind of hold things together. Now, we come on over to chapter 7. In chapter 7, we learn, after Jericho had fallen, that the children of Israel committed a trespass concerning the devoted thing, for Achan, the son of Carmi, took of the devoted thing, and the anger of the Eternal was kindled against the children of Israel. Now, Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai. Ai was a little village a little ways away. And, it's like Ai, by comparison to Jericho, Ai was just a little tiny place. I mean, it's like you'd come in and you had conquered Baton Rouge, and you decided to march on Denham Springs. Baton Rouge had already fallen, and so you figure, not going to take much to finish out what's left. Well, this is what they decided. They said, well, we don't want to bother and send everybody up to Ai. We just send a few, because it's a little spot in the road. We'll just have a mop-up operation. Well, they sent their mop-up operation up there, and their mop-up operation got mopped up. And all of a sudden, they came back with their tail tucked between their legs. And it reminds me of one time seeing I had a dog who was a city dog, and I took him to the country, and he was exposed to cows, and he was not particularly bold when he first saw them, but he found when he barked, they ran, and he was emboldened, and his heart was emboldened within him, and he took off, and he chased these cows, and he barked and he yapped, and they ran, and he was in great shape until they got over to a certain spot, and these 4 steers stopped, and they turned around, and they looked at him. And then they began to take steps toward him. And his heart melted within him, as it describes here, the people's heart, and it became as water, as it describes in Joshua chapter 7 and verse 5. Because as they took off, he took off, only his tail was between his legs, and I was up in a deer stand a ways away. The deer stand was, it had a ladder that came straight up. It was about 6 feet, 6.5, 7 feet up off the ground. And I looked, and what did I see but the dog having climbed the ladder? He got up in the deer stand with me, and the cows were down below. So his heart melted within him and became as water. And that's exactly what happened when the children of Israel went out to Ai. They were all emboldened, see. Everything in Jericho had fallen down, so they knew they were pretty rough stuff. And they came charging out to Ai. And the first thing that happened was it didn't work. like it had in Jericho. And so they came running back to Joshua with their tail tucked between their legs, and if he'd been up in the deer stand, they'd have come climbing up in there trying to, get a little protection from him too. Well, everybody was upset, and they couldn't figure out what the problem was, and Joshua was upset and wondered to know what it was, and God told him in verse 11 of chapter 7, He said, Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant which I commanded them. In verse 13, He said, sanctify the people, call them together, there's a curse in the midst. So they did so, and lots were cast, and it turned out in verse 18 that Achan was the man. And Joshua told Achan to make confession in verse 19, and Achan said, here in verse 21, when I saw these things, I coveted them, and I took them. And they're hidden in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. Achan and his family were stoned with stones, we're told in verse 25. And in chapter 8, in the end of verse 26, we're told that God turned away the fierceness of His anger. And in chapter 8, He told Joshua, don't be afraid, take the people of war and go to Ai, because I've delivered the city into your hands. Israel went from the height of ecstasy, the triumph of victory, all the way down to the agony of defeat in a matter of days. What was the difference? Well, the difference, obviously, was the difference between God's blessing and God's curse. God blessing His people and God removing that blessing. Why did God remove His blessing? God will not tolerate sin in the midst of His covenant people. God will not tolerate sin in the midst of His covenant people. Be ye clean that bear the vessels of the eternal. There cannot be sin in the midst of God's congregation, God's work, and God's blessing be received. Sin in the midst is a contaminating influence that spreads and that permeates. It cuts us off from God's blessing. God's church, God's work must be clean. When our ways please God, God will bless. God's work goes forward under God's power. God's work goes forward not by human might or by power, but by God's Spirit. And our ways must be pleasing in God's sight, and contamination in our midst. Sin has a contaminating influence that spreads. That's why it's compared to leavening. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. That's why Paul told the Corinthian church they had to purge out immorality in their midst. They had to purge it out and get rid of it if they tolerated it in their midst. If they had a compromising, tolerating attitude towards sin, God would remove His blessing. That's true individually, and that's true collectively as a body. God will not bless disobedience. And God does not bless a tolerant attitude towards sin. God has great mercy for repentant sinners, but never confuse God's tremendous mercy for repentant sinners with a tolerance for the practice of sin. There is a vast difference. The difference between the two is the life and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. God does not compromise with sin one iota. He sent His only begotten Son to pay the penalty in your stead and in mine. And if we want to turn from our sins and turn to Him, He will apply that penalty in our stead. He'll remove our sins as far from us as the east is from the west, but it is contingent upon our repentance, our surrender to Him. We're not saved in our sins, we're saved from our sins. And sin must be purged out. And this had to be learned by Israel of old. And this is the fourth lesson, stressed in the book of Joshua. That sin in our midst is a contaminating influence and must be purged out in order to secure God's blessing. So, Israel conquered Ai. In Joshua 8:28, it was burnt and made a heap. Joshua built an altar. As we go on forward in chapter 9, we find the Gibeonites, through stratagem, entering into a covenant with Israel. And in chapter 10, we find that Adonizedek, who was the king of Jerusalem, had gotten together a confederation of Canaanite kings. He said, look, this is a serious matter. Jericho, the keystone of our confederacy, the fortress that guarded our land there on the Jordan River, Jericho has fallen. Ai has been taken. The Gibeonites have already entered into an alliance with Israel. We have got to do something. We've got to strike or all is going to be lost. So Adonizedek put together a confederation that consisted of a number of the surrounding kings and to come and to smite Gibeon, because the Gibeonites had surrendered to Israel without a fight and had allied themselves with it. And he said, we're going to teach them a lesson. So we read of that in Joshua 10:4. Joshua 10 verse 7, Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people with him. They went up there and they attacked the forces of the Canaanites, the forces of Adonizedek. And in verse 11 of Joshua 10, that they fled before Israel, and there were great hailstones cast down. More died from the hailstones than the children of Israel slew. And the evening was bearing on very quickly, and Joshua spoke to the Eternal. And he said, sun, stand still upon Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the nation had avenged itself of their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stayed in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it, that the Eternal hearkened unto the voice of a man, for the Eternal fought for Israel. And in verse 20, Joshua and the children of Israel made an end of slaying them with a great slaughter until they were consumed. One of the greatest miracles that ever occurred in the history of the human race, one of the greatest miracles that is recorded in the pages of the Bible, comes right on the heels of an ignominious defeat at Ai. Here, a great victory occurred at Jericho through the power of God. God's forces, God will accomplish great things. God's work must be accomplished by His power. Sin contaminates, though, and removes God's blessing. Removes God's blessing from the furtherance of the work that He was doing here through Joshua. And yet, what we learn next, a fifth lesson we learn in the book of Joshua, is there is no miracle that is too great. There's no miracle that is too powerful, too great, too stupendous for God to work on behalf of His people when they're wholehearted in their obedience to Him. When God's people please Him and sin is removed from their midst, there's no limit to what God can and will do to give His people the victory. God will give the victory. Ultimately, the victory over sin in our own lives is not a victory that we win. It is a victory that Christ in us will win. The victory and the accomplishment, the achievement of the work of God, the completion of the work of God. And the Scriptures talk about that God will cut short His work. He will cut it short in righteousness. A short work will He make upon the earth. Talks about in the book of Romans. It talks about how that God will warn and will shake His people Israel with a warning and a witness. You can read it in the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel. You can read of these things that God is going to do and that God is going to accomplish, not because of our strength and ingenuity, but what God can do working in and through us as human beings as we yield ourselves to Him. God is going to shake this world. He's going to shake this world, and they shall know that there has been a prophet among them. That time is going to come, brethren. It really is. And the extent to which God is going to work through you or through me is going to depend partially on the extent to which we learn these lessons that God wrote down for our admonition, inspired Joshua to write down. There's no miracle that is too great for God to work to complete His work if God's people remove sin from their midst. We're close to God, and we purge out the sin out of our lives. But a tolerance for sin in our midst, a tolerance for sin in our lives individually or collectively will lead to God's curse. Because God does not compromise with sin. If He did, Jesus Christ would not have had to die. You know, Jesus prayed to the Father. He said, Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. If there's another way of doing it, if there is an easier, simpler, softer way, let's do it that way. But there's not an easier, softer way. There was not. Jesus Christ took that cup and He drank of it. He offered Himself as a sacrifice for us. He was our Passover, sacrificed for us. The price of sin comes high. We must never lose sight of it because God's grace is free, brethren. God's grace is freely offered and freely given, but never confuse free with cheap. Never confuse free with cheap. God's grace is free, but it didn't come cheaply. The cost was the life of our Savior. It's free to you and me. If we reach out to meet God's conditions, it's free. You can't earn it. You can't pay for it. The price has been paid. But oh, that price was so expensive. Here's a lesson. What God can do. Well, as we go on through, we find that this broke the back of the Canaanite Confederacy. Chapter 11 takes us on through some of the mop-up operation that occurred. And the things that occurred, and we come on down here in the end of chapter 11, in verse 23, that Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord spoke unto Moses. Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel, according to the division of their tribes, and the land had rest from war. Israel entered into rest. Now, you remember back in Hebrews, we're told if Joshua had given them rest, it wouldn't have had to be spoken of some other place in the Psalms and later on. The rest that Joshua gave them was not the ultimate rest. It was a type. Interestingly enough, the rest that Joshua gave them came after 6 years of labor to conquer the land. And it was at the beginning of the 7th year, the year of release, the sabbatical year, that the land entered into rest. I can prove that. That's not really the main point, but just to prove that, it's kind of an interesting point. God does work and uses numbers in a significant way. He spent 6 years subduing the land. And the proof of that is found in Joshua 14, where Caleb, as they go through here the next few chapters gives the specifics of the borders and which tribe got which portion. And to come on down here, and Caleb spoke up, and verse 10 of Joshua 14, and says, Now the Lord has kept me alive as He spoke these 45 years from the time that the Lord spoke this word unto Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And I'm 85 years old today. Now Caleb is speaking of the time when Moses promised him that he would inherit. And he said that God had kept him alive 45 years since that time. Now, Caleb, when did God speak that? Through Moses. When did God tell Moses that? Well, that was at the time, the account is in Numbers 13. That was 1 year after the Exodus. If you remember, 1 year from the Exodus, the spies went into the Promised Land, and they came back, and Caleb and Joshua brought the good report. And as a result, God said, all right, you're going to have to wander 40 years, which they'd already wandered a year, so that was 39 more to bring the total to 40. So, what we're reading now in Joshua chapter 14 and verse 10, Caleb says, is 45 years after God spoke those words through Moses. In other words, 46 years after the Exodus, because God spoke the words through Moses 1 year after the Exodus, and this is 45 years after that event, so 46 years after the Exodus. So 46 years after the Exodus, 40 years in the wilderness, 6 years conquering and subduing the land. That's the way we arrive at the fact that it took them 6 years to subdue the land, which is logical because they were going to enter into rest. And there was the system of the cycle of 7 years in the sabbatical principle. Anyway, that is an aside, but you can be aware of it. The next few chapters, as we come on through Joshua 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, we have the details of how the land was parceled out. And in chapter 23, we find that after God had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, Joshua called all Israel with the elders. And in verse 6 of Joshua 23, he says, "Be courageous to keep all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that you turn not aside from the right hand or to the left, that you come not among these nations, these that remain among you, neither make mention of the name of their gods, to cause to swear by them, neither serve them nor worship them, but cleave unto the eternal your God, as you have done this day." Because in verse 12, if you go back and cleave to the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they unto you, know of a certainty the Eternal will drive. He will not drive these nations out, but they will be a snare and a trap and a scourge in your side, and pricks in your eyes, until you perish from off the good land God has given. Now here's the sixth point that we should learn. God warned the people through Joshua about the dangers of compromise with the world. He warned them that after God had brought them in, after God had given them the land, after God had accomplished all the things that He had, He said, "Now look, there's one thing that will undo all of the blessings and the benefits. There's one thing that will undo. And that one thing is if you start compromising with the world. You let the world influence you. You let the world's values, you let the world's ways begin to influence you, and you begin to blend in. Because what's going to happen? You're going to begin to turn aside from the right hand or to the left. You're not going to stay on the track. You're going to start becoming like the world. Brethren, one of the greatest dangers to the people of God through the centuries is the danger of compromise. It is dangerous because it is so insidious. If you hold up something that is obviously the diametric opposite of what God has always said, people recognize it. But you lure them off the track through little, subtle compromises a little bit at a time. That's the way that Satan has worked on the people of God down through the centuries. That's the way Satan works in our lives individually. He doesn't come along and say, "Look, what you need to do is start going to church on Sunday morning instead of Saturday afternoon or Saturday morning." That's not where he starts. But, maybe what you ought to do is he doesn't start off and say, "Well, what you need to do is go out and get a job on the Sabbath." But maybe you can kind of fudge a little bit. You don't have to be quite so strict. And you kind of compromise a little bit here and compromise a little bit there. And you begin to let down here and let down there. And pretty soon you have edged yourself away to where you do things you would have never thought. We need to examine our lives, and we need to examine the changes we've made in our lives and ask ourselves, why did we make it? Why do you do the things you do? Do you do it because you think it's pleasing to God, or do you do it to blend in conformity with the world? God said that He left the Canaanite tribes in the land. The reason He didn't get rid of all of them to begin with was to prove the children of Israel. In Judges chapter 3 and verse 1, "These are the nations which the Eternal left to prove Israel by them." In verse 4 of Judges 3, "They were there to prove Israel by them, to know whether they would hearken unto the commandments of the Lord, which He commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses." And so what did they do? Verse 6, "They took their daughters to be their wives, gave their own daughters to their sons, and served their gods." They began to lose their identity. They lost their identity. They began the process of losing their identity physically by intermarriage, and losing their identity spiritually by blending and mixing in terms of accepting the culture, the society, the religion, and the ways. We, as God's people, need to preserve our identity. And it's a sad thing, because some among us want to see how far they can go to be like the world. That's not unique to us. That's not unique to our time. That's not unique to our congregation. That's not unique to right here. That has been the test. That has been the test that God has allowed on His people all the way down through the centuries. Brethren, the starting point is for us, young and old, to examine our lives and to ask ourselves, what are we doing? Or do we understand this lesson that God stressed through Joshua? Don't turn aside. Don't get off the track. When you turn aside from the right hand or to the left, you're getting off the track. You're jumping track, and you're not going to go down. You're not going to go forward if you jump track. He warned them about the influence of the nations around them. Influenced by their society, their culture, their customs, their religion, their value system. God's people must avoid the contaminating influence of the world and the tendency to compromise if they're to receive God's promises. Because that will undermine their relationship with God. That's the sixth point God stresses. And the final thing is stated in Joshua chapter 24, the last thing Joshua told Israel. He said in Joshua 24, verse 14, "Now therefore fear the Eternal and serve Him in sincerity and in truth. And put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve you the Eternal. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Eternal, choose this day whom you'll serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river, in other words, the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Eternal." Joshua told Israel that ultimately all of us must make a choice. Are we going to go back to what God brought us out of? Are we going to blend into what we're in the midst of? Or are we going to cleave to the eternal God and serve Him how? Serve Him in sincerity and in truth. You know, the Apostle Paul quoted that in 1 Corinthians 5 when he said that, "Let us therefore keep the feast." It says, "Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but," Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5, "with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." The book of Joshua opens up with the celebration of the Passover and the preparation for that celebration, and it ends up with a spiritual lesson that applies to these days. Serving God in sincerity and truth. There are many lessons, 7 that have been detailed here this afternoon from this book of Joshua. This book that focuses in many, many ways on this festival season. Much of the action and the involvement is focused here on this festival season. It's very likely, very possible, that this gathering at the end of Joshua's life was during the days of unleavened bread. Very possibly the gathering of Israel to Shiloh there to celebrate the Passover in the days of unleavened bread, and Joshua addressed them and emphasized that all of us must make a choice. But the book of Joshua stresses to us that first and foremost we must have a commitment. We must have a commitment to go forward and to do the work that God has called us to do. To go forward with Christ, to go forward boldly and with confidence to accomplish the work of God. But before we can go forward to do that, we must become truly converted. We must be circumcised in heart and in mind. We must become receptive to God's influence. Thirdly, we must realize that God's work is accomplished by God's power, not by our own strength or might, but by the power of the eternal God. Fourthly, we must recognize that sin in our midst is a contaminating influence, and it will cut us off from God's blessing. God's church must be clean. Fifthly, we must recognize and realize that there is no miracle that is too great for God to perform when His people are pleasing to Him and when sin is removed from our midst. When our ways please God, God will bless us. God's people must avoid, as a sixth point, the contaminating influence of the world and the tendency to compromise if we're to retain God's promises. We must always be on guard in our lives for the contaminating influence of the world around and the tendency to blend in and to compromise. And ultimately, as a final seventh point, we must make a personal choice. We must make a personal choice as to what we will do in our lives. And that choice, the choice that Joshua made, and the choice that God tells each and every one of us to make, is the choice that we will serve God, the eternal God, that we will serve God in sincerity and truth. That service to God, that service in sincerity and truth, is what the days of unleavened bread is all about. Jesus Christ is the author and finisher of our faith. He started us out and He'll finish us up. The book of Joshua is the story of conquest. It's the story of overcoming. It's the story of triumph. It's the triumph of God's people, led by God, on track. Brethren, if that story is to be the story of our lives, then we've got to apply these lessons in our lives, personally and individually.